in rethinking net zero, the question that's obviously up there is, why would you need to rethink it? Isn't it just obvious? Shouldn't we just get on with it? Shouldn't we just work our way to the conclusion of what's going to deliver the outcomes? That's it. Well, not quite. And that's because net zero is a deceptively simple concept. We need to go behind it and ask, what's the question to which net zero is supposed to be the answer? Now, again, you might say, well, it's climate change, isn't it? The trouble is that net zero isn't the answer to mitigating climate change. It contributes, but achieving net zero does not result in stopping causing climate change. And I'll explain why that's the case. But before I get there, let's just stand back and ask another question, which is, in mitigating climate change, how well is it going? After more than 30 years since the baseline of 1990, is it going well? Are we making progress? Are we on course to bring the processes of climate change to a halt? And the sobering reality is, not only is net zero not going to necessarily achieve stopping causing climate change, but we've achieved very, very little in over 30 years. It's going very badly. And there's no escaping that. It's not pessimism or optimism, it's just realism. And to see why that's the case, we have to work out, what the problem of climate change is. You may think you know what that is. You may think it's just, well, we just got to stop doing the emissions. No, that's part of it. But climate change is about the stock of carbon in the atmosphere. That's what the greenhouse effect comes from. It's the way in which solar radiation penetrates and bounces back with our atmosphere in between. And carbon is just a proxy for those greenhouse gases and their concentrations. So what we've got to try to do is stop changing the composition of our atmosphere. Now, because it's a stock, it's the product of two things: what goes in and what comes out. So we concentrate almost overwhelmingly on what goes in, and that's about emissions. Doesn't matter where the emissions take place, anywhere in the world. Doesn't matter really what the source is. We do need to slow down our injection of those extra bits of carbon into the atmosphere. Now, it also matters what comes out, because our natural world sequestrates carbon. Indeed, our natural world is made of carbon. You and I are made of carbon. And the sequestration process is essentially the natural capital of our planet, primarily the plants, extract the carbon, sequestrate it, and therefore reduce the stock of carbon in the atmosphere. So we're doing very badly because we're both not limiting the emissions seriously, and we're destroying the ability of the planet to sequestrate. And on that latter point, if you just want an illustration, look at some of those ghastly photographs of the burning Amazon. Look at the destruction in the Congo, in the Mekong. Think about what we're doing to the seas, the coastal margins, and think about the destruction of forests on a global scale. That's all part of damaging the ability of the natural world to sequestrate, to take out some of what we're putting in. Now, if you add that together, increased emissions and reduced sequestration, it's not surprising that the carbon concentration in the atmosphere has been going up. Indeed, it's been going up by about 2 parts per million for over 30 years. Just think about that. It's not a blip until you get to very, very recently. And even the recent blip is offset by the damage on the sequestration side. So, great financial crisis, not in the data, right? And if you look at the COVID lockdowns, yes, emissions came down. We did one of the greatest experiments in how to reduce emissions by stopping economies. But the sequestration side continued to deteriorate. So here we are on 420 parts per million, having come up a long way from the industrial levels. So if we want to really deal with climate change, if we want to make sure that we're going to stop causing climate change, we've got to do a lot on both the emissions and the sequestration side. We have to realise we don't have a bottomless pit of money to throw at every aspect of climate change. It's not to say you shouldn't do some of these other things, but it does say you have to be what I would call economically grown up about this and recognise we have to prioritise. It's called strategy. And we have to do those things which are going to make most difference. So net zero as currently measured doesn't do the job. It's carbon consumption. We cause quite a lot more pollution than we think we do. We should pay for that if we want to stop causing further climate change. And we should specialise in those things that we contribute to at the global level. But what about net zero at the global level? How's that going? Well, we're 27 COPs down, and we ain't made a dent in the increase in carbon concentration in the atmosphere. Another 27 COPs aren't going to achieve it. And having spurious targets for the sake of having targets is of questionable value. At the Paris COP, the whole purpose was, following the earlier Durban COP, that we're going to have legally binding targets on as many countries as possible. Well, there was never going to be legally binding targets, and there ain't any. We were going to keep to 2 degrees at Paris. Well, it was pretty obvious that what people offered at Paris didn't add up to 2 degrees. So what did they do? Did they say, we need to rethink, we need to look at this problem again? Or did they say, tell you what, we can't do 2 degrees, so we'll announce 1.5 as the target? You just couldn't make this stuff up. So here we are, post Glasgow. We have the latest IPCC report, which tells us very clearly what the science says, and it's not good. And it says, effectively, we're not going to achieve 1.5. So what's the UN COP process response to this? Oh, well, if we're not going to achieve the 1.5 target, let's change the 250 net zero targets to 240 for the developed countries. Well, I put it to you that in 29 years, getting to net zero in a serious sense is a very, very big ask. I wouldn't bet on us achieving it. Might do, but I doubt it. If you tell me that you want to get to net zero for a developed country in 16 or 17 years from where we currently are, then I think you're just deluding yourself, like the Paris lot deluded themselves about 1.5. Setting targets into the future when existing politicians won't be in government might make us all feel good, but doesn't solve one iota of the climate change problem. So what do I conclude from all of this? I conclude that if we are going to have targets, they should be properly defined. I conclude from this that if we are going to spend money on net zero, and we should, then we should spend it on the things which make the greatest contribution to mitigating climate change. And I conclude too, that if we go on like this, on an unsustainable path, then it will not be sustained. I've never met anyone, any sensible person who believes that what we're doing to the climate and biodiversity, to the environment, is sustainable. Almost everybody rationally ends up with the position that what we're doing is unsustainable. But very few people draw the conclusion. If something's unsustainable, it will not be sustained. So you have to think quite hard about what our world looks like with, 3 degrees warming plus, with a whole chunk of the biodiversity gone, and all the consequences that flow from that. So far, what we've done is just scared ourselves to death with that to try to make people do more now. And there's some merit in that. But the other side of it is to face up and plan for what that world is going to look like. Because going on as we are at the moment is not a path that's going to end up in a very nice sunny place, or rather, it's going to end up in a very hot place. Thank you very much.